Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is set to hold his first formal news conference since the election later today. This comes one day after provincial leaders in Alberta and Saskatchewan put Ottawa on notice, with Jason Kenney saying they're going to force their issues onto the national agenda come hell or high water. John Manley is a former cabinet minister under the Liberals under Jean Chrétien, serving as Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister, Industry Minister, now Senior Business Advisor at Bennett Jones and Board Chair of CIBC and CAE. So a little bit of an underachiever, John, but we're glad to have you on nevertheless. Let's talk about the storyline that is emerging post-election, that of a deeply fractured and divided country and parts of this country that feel completely ignored by Ottawa. Does it resonate with you and the community that you're in touch with?
Oh, absolutely, Amber. I think it's hard to perceive in Ottawa or in Toronto, for that matter, just how disconnected from the Canadian economy Western Canada, particularly Alberta, feels at the present time. Whereas the rest of the country is doing quite well, thank you very much. Unemployment rates record low, jobs being created. In downtown Calgary right now, it just doesn't feel that good. And so making sure that the policymakers in Ottawa really understand the depth of concern there is something that the Prime Minister is going to have to address, and it's not made any easier by having lost his MPs that previously came from Alberta.
And what is the right approach? Because Ottawa's approach is to put climate change very much front and center, and that seems directly at odds with supporting a carbon-heavy industry. Is there a middle ground that can be found, and do you think there is political will to do so?
Well, I think there needs to be political will on both sides here. Premier Kenney broke with the tradition of Canadian politics when he, as a provincial premier, went and campaigned against the Prime Minister in another province than his own. And so there's a little bit of bridge building there. That's a bit of a declaration of war. It's not nation building, it's not constructive. So I think a little bit of humility on both sides, a little bit of reaching out to understand both sides is important. I mean, there are going to be lots of theories about why parties did what they, performed as they did in the election. But quite frankly, Amber, I think that the Conservative position on climate shut them out of all of urban Canada except for Calgary and Edmonton. And so for that industry, and in many parts of that industry, addressing the challenge of reducing carbon emissions is something they take very seriously, and they're working at, and they're accomplishing it. For other parts, there's if it's not denial of climate change, it's certainly being interpreted that way. So there's work to be done on all sides here.
We've been sharing some of the views from Albertans just to highlight that feeling of alienation. We've also been looking to social media. John, you've probably heard or seen the headlines around this trend, this Wexit trend. What do you make of that at a time when there are heightened tensions in a lot of countries around the world? We're watching what's unfolding right now, for example, with the Brexit story. What do you make of the idea of a separatist push coming from Alberta?
Well, I don't think it makes much sense, to tell you the truth. I mean, we've been dealing with that since the 1960s in Quebec, where you've got you're not landlocked. Secondly, you've got a cohesive language and culture. In Alberta, exactly how many pipelines are going to be built by being isolated and entirely landlocked? So I don't think it makes a lot of sense, and I wish that energy was being directed to something more positive and constructive, rather than being spent on something that it's a great slogan, but it's not likely to go very far. I mean, I know a lot of Albertans. I've spent a lot of time in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. I mean, I remember Peter Zosky described Saskatchewan as the quintessential Canadian province. These people are Canadians first, and I think they feel a sense of alienation from Ottawa and from the power brokers on Bay Street, but they definitely are loyal Canadians, and I don't think there's there's a very large group of people that actually think seriously that they want to leave Canada.
Well, Jason Kenney himself even admitted that that's not realistic because of, in part the landlocked nature. Right. But he also talked about those base trade power brokers, saying that in his conversations, they are desperately interested in what is happening to Alberta's economy. Is there a movement? Because we've heard various banks talk quite openly about the need for competitiveness challenges to be addressed and almost explicitly for pipelines to be approved in this country. Is there a movement behind the scenes by these senior business leaders on Bay Street to, bend the ear in Ottawa to try and move that agenda a little bit forward?
Well, I think that there are a lot of people providing that advice to Ottawa. I think I talked with you during the election campaign and said the business leaders are not paying too much attention to what the candidates are saying, because there's really not much about the economy in the campaign. But now the messages are being delivered. And I think what the Prime Minister needs to master is the vocabulary that recognizes the importance of natural resources to our overall economy. It's still a third of our economy. So all of the nice things that politicians like to do on the social spending side are in 1/3 funded by our natural resource sector. So we've got to have a vocabulary that recognizes the need to address climate change, at the same time recognizing that it's vitally important that we get our resources to market, because that's how we pay for much of what we do. And let's face it, the world is not going zero carbon anytime soon. And were we to withdraw from supplying markets, others from Russia and Saudi Arabia and Nigeria and Libya
right.
would be there to supply. So we've got to get the language right. And first job of the Prime Minister has always been nation building, and sometimes it's easy, and most of the time it's not. And this time it's particularly difficult because of the double challenges of the Bloc Québécois and Western alienation.
Well, let's talk about the pipeline at the center of that nation building, because now we're looking at this minority government and what kind of balancing act we're going to have to see for the Liberal government with the NDP, the Bloc, whoever it is. But obviously those parties have strong views on pipelines. The Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, was on this very program yesterday where he said, quote, "We will move forward on this project because we know it is the right thing to do. We need to ensure we get access to global markets." How will this government make that happen?
Well, I think they've already put everything in place to make it happen. I think that when you look at it, the recent court decision actually is very favorable to getting this done. But I think that they are taking a very pragmatic approach, which is to respect the processes that are in place. Some have suggested declare it a project in the national interest. I'm not sure that exactly does what they want to accomplish. And I know there is rampant theories out there in parts of Canada that say, well, they bought the pipeline to shut it down. That's about as daft as I can think of. They could have shut it down without having to spend $4 billion on it. So I think this is going ahead, and in Parliament, there's nothing left to approve. This pipeline has been approved. There are a few remaining legal hurdles that need to be dealt with, and those will be dealt with not in the parliamentary forum, but in the courtroom. The only way it comes to Parliament is if a party moves a motion of non-confidence in the government and bases that motion on the continuation of the construction of the pipeline. And theoretically, you could imagine the NDP or maybe the Greens doing that, or the Bloc doing that. I have to think that the Conservatives would not support such a motion, precipitating an election brought on by the refusal of Parliament to proceed with the construction of TMX. I don't think that's very plausible. So I see this getting done.